Hey, and welcome back to another session of the series Show of Your CI/CD Pipeline. And today I'm really happy to be joined by, I don't know, by someone that beat me in the last Gameday WorldChampionship. So very warm welcome, Martyn. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed beating you in the championships.
Can imagine, yeah. But it has also been the start of a fruitful conversation. So I'm really glad to have you here. And I think I can congratulate you again, right? You joined the Community Builders program just a few days ago.
Yeah. So I'm not actually in the Slack, but I've got the signed the NDA and I've been accepted into the serverless category. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Because actually this series is meant to be builders showing off their stuff, right? So it's really cool that on kind of before actually joining Slack, you're able to contribute to the community. And I'm really looking forward to see what else you're going to be sharing with us in the community builders. So before we get started, want to tell us just like a bit about yourself? What is your current role? What are you doing? And what drives you to be successful?
Yeah, so I'm Martyn Kilbryde. I'm a principal software architect at a company called D55. We're an advanced consulting partner. So we've been working in AWS now for, I think it's about 5 years, but I've been with the company for 2 years. And previous to that, I was all on-prem, only touched the cloud occasionally, at home. So yeah, all kicked off in AWS really 2 years ago. But yeah, it's been a great journey. So yeah, day to day, I'm working with multiple clients. So since I've been working here, I think I've worked with 3 or 4 clients, and they all have different technologies and different CI/CD systems and so on. So yeah, it's definitely a great way to build knowledge. And yeah, we're sort of trying to specialize as much as possible into cloud native and serverless, which is where I've then started doing that at home and really getting into it as well.
Cool. So thank you so much for taking the time today and showing us something that you have built or something that you're working on. Especially we're going to once again focus on the CI/CD part of it, right? So how is the continuous integration and the continuous deployment of the project that we're going to look at? How are we setting it up? What are your main problems or your main benefits? Before we move over to sharing your screen, what is the project about that we're going to look at?
So one of the things that we found when we started working with infrastructure as code, because when I started, the only thing we've done really is sort of CloudFormation. And if you've worked in CloudFormation directly, it's pretty painful with all the just YAML files. So we moved across to CDK. And as part of that, we've had to design the CI/CD pipelines with the client. And since then, we've worked with Terraform and with Azure DevOps, Circle CI, and loads of different systems. And we always use the same sort of premise of creating a dev environment per branch. Mm-hmm. So that's all developers get their own environment. Now, because we're working with these clients and we can't actually show exactly what we built for them. So I built a sample in GitHub, which shows how to take a standard CDK pipeline, it's just a CDK application, which just has a few different resources, and turn that into something that can deploy out multiple branches, like to the same account. So you have your own dev environment and how that kind of works, some of the gotchas and that sort of thing. So I'll take you through that, but I can also kind of describe through how in a client system, it would actually be a bit more complicated, and we can get onto the fact that the open source version doesn't take all of that into consideration, which is probably not the best, but it's a conversation.
And that's fair. And this is also why I'm starting this series to openly talk about the challenges of building CI/CD pipelines and why it is important to start projects with the CI/CD pipeline, right? And also we as a community, we might need to start sharing some more stuff that we do, especially to ensure that the pipeline's quality also gets better. There's a few initiatives. Have you heard of the DPRA, Deployment Pipeline Reference Architecture?
No.
that's something that AWS is driving to start really talking and standardizing the way that we look at pipelines and deployment strategies. And that's the direction that I think we also need to invest into in a community. Cool. So thanks a lot. That's a lot of context into what we're going to look at. So now let's switch over, look a little bit into how does your open source project look like that you have, and let's try to understand how the pipeline looks like. And if you're ready, feel free to start sharing your screen.
Okay.
So this is directly the open source project. It's cool. Let's get started. How do we walk through it?
Okay, so the way I've split this down is to try and demonstrate the before and after. So there's actually 2 CDK applications in this repo, but the CI that's set up in the repo is actually just on the second, for the obvious reasons that the first isn't really compatible. So just as a very quick intro of what we're actually looking at, I actually took this from serverless land, which great resource. Everyone should go onto serverless land. So it was originally from serverless land with a few little tweaks, just so we had several different serverless resources that I can actually have a quite interesting application. So it doesn't really matter too much, just that you need to know that the entrance to the application is an API gateway. And if you hit that gateway with some sentences, it'll use a step function to go off to Poly to generate some MP3s. So we need to have a couple of stateful resources, which is important, I'll get to later, as well as stateless resources, which does have some nuances when you're building larger applications. So I'll just show you a little quick.
Just short question. I always, when I talk to builders, I see a lot of architecture diagrams. What I tend to not see is an overview of the development flow through the project at the end. I don't think that you might have something ready for that, or is this something we're going to look at?
There's a little bit of development flow, which is, and this is where I like to get your feedback, actually, and the community's feedback, is because you're dead on when it comes to working with different clients to build a CI/CD pipeline. You go online, you look at open source, and there's very little there for CI/CD, and there's very little there for development process. You just get the usual Git flow or something like that. How does it actually apply to the real world? So I've tried to simulate a little bit and show a little bit of that in the diagrams, but it's definitely something that going forward I'd like to do more of. So hopefully, as we go through it, you might be able to give some feedback on what would actually be more useful as well going forward.
Happy to do so. This is exactly the kind of conversations I want to have. So let's look at it, right? What do we have?
Okay, so this first diagram should be just to very quickly explain what we're going to be showing. So we have multiple environments, a production, a staging, and a dev, and each one of these is an account. And the idea is that for staging, we will deploy the main branch. And then when we go to production, we'll tag it, and it'll be the tag going to production. But for dev, we might have a team of 10 people working there. Now, I know some companies will have a separate AWS account per person. In the past, we've had single dev environments or shared dev environments, and you have to try and pick one, such as like you might have multiple colors. So I'm using blue today, that sort of thing. What we've done generally is we'll have a ticket, and the branch will be named after the ticket. So these are sort of JIRA IDs. And when you create that branch, it'll create a whole new environment in dev on the same account. Now, the sequence...
Before we move on, a stupid question maybe. Why did you decide to deploy to production from a tag?
We've actually had a couple of different scenarios, depends on the customer, but the general idea is if we stick with a main branch for staging, and then when the testing has been completed, we tag that will then go to production, and we'll treat main, because this isn't fully continuous deployment to production,
Okay.
because they have these gates that they want to go through. So in that case, what we do is everything gets merged to main as soon as we're happy with CI and it's working. But main, we treat main like production in the sense you don't only merge into main when you're happy, but it's not been tested by and gone through compliance and all the other things that need to happen for some of these clients. So in that case, we're using the tag. We've used in the past a release branch for that to merge into release, and release is a continuous deployment to production.
Okay, so the pipeline, and so you have different pipelines or workflows that are being executed on the one side for the dev branches, feature branches, but also for the main branch and then for the tag branch, or is it kind of the same pipeline with different parameters?
It's similar pipelines, and I have more diagrams I can show to maybe demonstrate that. Okay. So they have exactly the same sort of test and build, build and unit test, I should say. But when it comes to the deployment, there's a slight nuances. Staging and production is basically the same though, but for dev, it's a little bit different.
Cool.
So the sequence is fairly simple, but just to put it into a very simple diagram. So we have the main branch. Now we'll branch off that, and these are short-lived branches, which is named after the ticket. Now, as soon as that gets created, that'll deploy a new environment into the development AWS account, and that can be developed and tested and so on. And
can we define short-lived? Because short-lived can be 1 minute, it can be 2 days, it can be 1 week, depends on your organization. So how do you define short-lived?
So we like to work Kanban, where each ticket should be broken down to about a day. Don't really believe in estimating and saying having multiple tickets. We'll always try and get to the point where our ticket equals a day, and it sort of equals out, and we'll break it down to that point. Therefore, the branch should be a day at most.
Okay.
If we have a branch that's open for longer than several days, then that's when I start to hover over the delete button on that branch because it's really annoying me.
Good.
So
thanks for that details.
Yeah, no problem. It's and you know, I've worked in an organization that had hundreds of developers where there's branches that are open for months. It is a pet peeve that they just get left, definitely.
Yeah, then you get into merge hell and that kind of stuff, right? So I've been there as well. But I think it requires to have the mindset to be able to deliver short pieces of code, right? And that's not always the case for all projects that you work with at the end.
Yeah, and it's required quite a big push in the past to get to that point where we've needed to say to everyone, look, every bit of code you write should be safe to go to production. So if that's feature flags or some other, depending on the language, you might be able to use different nuances to hide it behind config, but everything you do must be able to go to production and must be small, something you can do in a day and get tested and get out. And it really, really speeds up the pipeline. They say merge hell otherwise. So at this point, we've got a development environment, and a large part of this is because we're working with serverless, and obviously even the AWS advice with serverless is don't rely on unit tests. It's more like the testing hexagon. If you've ever seen the testing hexagon versus the testing pyramid, where you actually have more integration tests and you do most of your testing in the cloud and not locally. So it's really important to have this environment on an AWS account. That's where we expect people to do their testing. Because it's infrastructure as code, we're expecting people to be writing the code, pushing it up, and it to be deployed, not going directly into the console to develop. But obviously that's where the testing will happen. But
you still use the pipeline to trigger the deployment, or is the developer experience in a sense like the developer should also run CDK deploy or Terraform apply from his local PC? What is the expectation?
We'd like to give the options. The expectation is when you pick up a ticket, the first thing you do is create a branch, an empty branch. That'll create that environment. That might take several minutes, so get that done. Then you can push remote, and that'll get it deployed as much as you want. But if you want a really quick, rapid feedback loop, you can use CDK locally now that the branch exists to keep deploying it from your PC, such as using like CDK Watch or something like that. So it's deploying quickly. We don't really mind because when the PR is created and CI is reporting that at that point, it's basically wiped over what's been deployed. The only nuance there is if somebody's gone and changed something in the cloud, CDK won't necessarily overwrite it. So there is always that slight risk if you allow people to do that. But I hate having them long loops where you've got to wait for NPM installs in the cloud, and then a CDK deploy, and then for it to say after like 5, maybe 10 minutes that it's just updated one small property somewhere when you could have just ran it locally.
Makes sense. Thanks a lot.
So you've got this feedback loop going on where they're doing development, and at this point, and it does depend on the squad. We'll usually have a squad on our side where we'll have a tester, and that tester can get involved at a really early stage if we want to do any additional QA testing before it gets merged in. So if there's anything that needs manually testing, or a new automation test needs adding, then that could be added at this stage. But at the very least, there'll be a peer review. And that peer review won't be to test the application, but it'll be to make sure the developer say to them, have you tested this? And look for the code and make sure CI is working and all the automation is passing.
So do you run a different workflow on the pull request creation than you run on the branch creation?
It's dependent on the CI system we've used. So we've used Code Pipeline before, which is running on a branch. It never runs on a PR. With Azure DevOps, that actually has a nuance of running on a PR, and it runs on the PR by doing a merge on a sort of hidden branch and then runs on that. So it's actually running on the changes in your branch merged with the branch you're pulling into, which is obviously a lot safer than running on your branch, which could be out of date. And when the person comes to merge it, you can then have a problem. With GitHub, you can obviously enforce that a pull request can't be merged unless it's up to date, which does help if you've got that enabled and using something like Code Pipeline or Circle CI or Github Actions to make sure that the CI on the branch is running and that's actually a merged version of where you're going. But we've definitely had issues where we've merged something in and then it's broken main because what was on your branch wasn't up to date with main, or maybe two people merged at a very similar time. So it's been an issue, but I think by enforcing that you can't merge, it does, unless it's up to date, it's definitely helped for that problem. So at that point, once you've got that pull request and you're happy, the pull request gets approved and merged in, this branch gets deleted. And then depending again on the CI system, sometimes you can directly, so in Github Actions, which is the example I'll show in a second, you can directly run an action or a CI job to run a CDK destroy. If you're running on, say for Code Pipeline, we had it, so Code Pipeline the stack needs actually running in when you create the branch. So you create the branch and then you actually have to do a CDK deploy of the pipeline for your branch. And then at the end, it needs to delete itself. So at that point, we actually had a webhook coming from GitHub into a very small stack, which just deletes. In Azure DevOps, you can't actually have a CI job that runs on a delete or a webhook, as far as I'm aware.
You can or you can't?
You can't.
You can. Okay.
So we had a problem with that. So we ended up creating a little application which runs on Event Bridge schedules, which every so often goes to Azure DevOps, looks at the branches that are in Git, looks at what's deployed, and then says, oh, this branch no longer exists. I can now delete it. So we've had multiple patterns for doing the exact same action, depending on the CI system.
So just as we're using GitHub Actions here, does GitHub Actions the possibility to listen to a branch delete?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Which makes it a lot simpler. Some of the systems we've had you can only, I think Azure DevOps was one of them, you can run on a pull request merge which is great. But what if you create a branch and then delete the branch without doing a pull request? So then we end up with lots of branches hanging around. And when a branch directly equals a full CDD stack in your dev account, and that could have 100 resources in it, you can end up hitting limits in your account because you've left things around. So just as a very quick overview of something, I'll show the GitHub action, and then I'll show potentially with a client how it kind of gets expanded a little bit. So the workflow, obviously, in GitHub Actions, we've just got two. We've got when you push, the actions will run, and and again, this is where we can get onto some of the slight differences, where this is a really simple open source project. It's got a really simple CI pipeline, and this would not be something you would use with a client, because you want to have unit tests and you want to have production in multiple environments. So so all this is going to do is check it out. It's going to install Node and set up AWS, install dependencies, and then we're just going to do a CDK deploy. And when we do the CDK deploy, we pass in the name of the branch. And that, with CDK, and I'll show you some of the code I've had to do, will then mean that we can create a full environment with the name of the branch in the environment. And then on a delete, we can basically do the same actions, but at the end we're doing a CDK destroy. And again, it's got the name of the branch in there. So if I'll create a branch, and then we can see it run. It'll take a few minutes, so it'll be worth doing. So branch off main. So as soon as we create that branch, we'll go and start running this workflow. And if we have a look at the actual application, we've got several stacks in here. So I'll start with the full creation. So to try and demonstrate some of the use cases, because we found quite a lot, we might have a large application with a lot of resources. Sometimes you have common resources, so you don't want to deploy the full application for every developer, such as a VPC. You'd probably share the VPC. So if the branch that we're deploying is trunk, so we've got that configured as main, then we'll deploy the actual common stack. In this case, we've just got a common notification stack. But for each development branch, we're not going to deploy that particular stack. And then we have two stacks, a stateful stack and a stateless stack, which is just a pattern that we found quite useful. And there's a whole conversation there around how you organize stacks. But we found having a stateful stack with your stable resources like S3 and databases in versus stateless means that you can always just delete the stateless if you end up in a weird situation where CloudFormation does not like to update because you've changed a logical ID or something like that. And always, this one big thing that I'd like to make sure everyone knows is you can tag a stack. And if you add a tag to a stack, it'll tag all the resources in that stack that support tags. So it's really useful in this scenario because we can add the branch as a tag. So then we can use Resource Explorer and we can try and find all the things that relate to a specific branch, which does help when you have potentially lots of things hanging around.
Yeah, that's a great feature of CDK, to just take the tags and apply it to all of the resources that you have, right? Really love that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So if I want to have a look at this.
So let me ask a kind of personal question here. I've been seeing you posting a lot on .NET stuff, but looking at here is TypeScript, right? Why?
So we actually started with a long time ago. So I think it was about 10 years before I started at D55, was a .NET developer and working on-prem with Microsoft and so on. And when I came to this company, the people who started the company, they were also .NET developers. They started with .NET Lambdas and hit quite a few issues. This was, many years ago. So, the big one being cold starts, just Lambdas being incredibly slow at that time. You didn't have the support that you do now. Like the .NET team at AWS have been really good. Recently, they're really pushing. So we very quickly got burned on that and switched to Node.
Okay.
Then when I started, we moved from JavaScript to TypeScript, and it's still pretty much my preference if I'm going to build something that's really quick to get up and running and it's typed. Now we are now looking, because we've got a lot of .NET developers in the company, at using .NET, because you can do .NET CDK and .NET Lambdas, and they're a lot better now than they used to be. So recently I've built an open source project in .NET, just so I can actually try and find the nuances. So yeah, I like to try a few, but yeah, I think TypeScript is still a little bit faster. So at that point, if we go to the environment, so yeah, I've created it. So as you can see, we've got the common stack, which was created by main. So these ones were pre-existing from our main branch. But what we've done is we've created 2 more stacks, which are named after the branch. Now, the first obvious thing to be careful of is we're including the name of the branch in the stack. So definitely need to have something built in to try and make sure that people don't create really long stack branch names with strange characters in.
So just one comment on that.
The fact that branches.
Sorry, I think I have my PC issues again. Short comment on that. That actually means that the CDK app that we are building, or that we're looking at here, is aware of the branch, and that means all of the resources also need to be branch aware somehow.
Yes, yeah. And the interesting thing with it is, with CDK by default, obviously it'll name the resources based on the logical ID, based on the stack name. So in a lot of cases, you can just create the name of the stack with the branch, and the resources in there will automatically get named with the name of the stack in there. Sometimes, though, that's not the case. And it'll just create a name which has got a hash on the end. So step functions are one of the examples where if you don't specifically name it, it'll come up with a unique name. And that's fine, it'll work great. But if you've got 10 developers all with their own stacks, and then you go and look at step functions, you'll see loads of step functions in there which have random names, and you don't know which one's yours. So if you are going to go down this route, you'll find that, so looking at the stateful stack, we actually pass, this one, we pass the branch name into the stack so that we can name the resources with that in there. And if I have a look at the stateless stack, we have, the synchronizer state machine. So if we have a look here, so we've got the name of the state machine defined.
Okay.
And I'd say it's optional, but it's definitely helpful to keep in mind that when we're creating these resources, sometimes you can rely on the auto names, sometimes you can't. So yeah, at this point, we've got the full app there, and I won't go into demonstrate the app because it's not really what we need to talk about, but there's definitely a few things that you need to be aware of. The names of the stacks and the names of the things I've just discussed. Stateful resources, by default, CDK usually retains them when you delete a stack. So if you don't take that into consideration, you can end up with a lot of DynamoDBs and S3 buckets just hanging around forever. And I have had to sit there deleting them manually at some point, or writing scripts to try and clean up where we've left behind an S3 bucket that we didn't realize for 6 months, and there's just lots and lots of them.
I've been there too, yeah.
Now, especially if you've got CDK, if you've got the option to delete the stack when you destroy the to delete the bucket when you destroy the stack, then it'll create a Lambda for you, which will empty the bucket, and then the bucket will get deleted. Because otherwise you can't just go and delete that bucket manually. You've got to empty each bucket. That can be pretty painful. So one of the examples I've got in here in the stateful stack is we actually pass in a property which is to whether to destroy on stack removal. And that, if I go back, I think I showed it before, but just to point that out, we're driving that effectively from if the branch is based on the name of the trunk. So if it's not main. So if you were going to use the system where you merge to release for production, then obviously you'd have to change that to be not main or release or that sort of thing. You could also go the other way around and say if the branch looks like TST dash some numbers, whatever's safest, but obviously you'd have to be quite careful to make sure that this is only going to destroy for non-production. And then in them resources, it's a property on there with a removal policy, which is whether to destroy or retain. And same with the auto delete objects, which is in S3 is a separate property. So you can't just have a removal policy. You also need to make sure you have that set if you want to wipe the bucket at the same time. Otherwise it won't delete it, and that can be quite painful as well.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think at this point, let's say we've got the branches, and we've been in a situation where we've had maybe 20 of these, and this is for a client application that had hundreds of resources, but it was really useful, especially since it's all in one AWS account. When you come to review or when you come to pair program, you can go into the same account and you can go and look into it, look at CloudWatch logs and debug together, and test it as close to production as possible. Obviously, there's still that slight nuance of if you want to update the common stack, let's say you have a VPC, you want to make a VPC change, that will impact all of the stacks. So that is something that if you need that pattern, such as VPCs, then you're going to have to try to manually test that in a separate account maybe, and then push it into main, which will then deploy it to dev, and actually could deploy that to staging as well. So there's always that slight risk with anything that's going to be common.
Cool, thanks. Can we have a look on that delete process as well? The way that you mentioned it earlier is now at the moment that you delete the branch, it's going to automatically kick off the delete process, which is then going to delete the environment for that branch, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if we do a pull request and then merge and delete, or in this case, I'll just delete just to speed that up, then at that point, the GitHub action will start running, and this will go through a similar process to NPM install, etc., and then it'll do a destroy.
Cool. Can we just bring up that YAML file again for the workflow configuration?
Yeah. Let's have a look.
Because there you have the trigger on the branch delete, right?
Yeah.
This is, by the way, something that is not that easily doable in Jenkins, right? I've been using Jenkins a lot, and it is not just kind of available, right? So you need to trigger on webhooks for that. Same for, I think Code Catalyst also does not yet offer a possibility to execute a workflow on branch delete. This is really, I think, something that is pretty cool.
And we've found that GitHub's the only one that's been the easiest for that, because if you don't have the branch, you can't run the code on that branch to delete itself. And so we've had that with Code Pipeline, where, like say, we've created our pipeline per branch, and then the branch disappears, the pipeline needs to also disappear. So we actually need to go quite meta and have a branch that will delete the branch, it gets quite painful. So we've written little applications with little API gateways just specifically called stack deleters, and they're there to delete stacks and clean up stacks and so on.
Yeah, I've seen that as well, and I think that's one of the things that I've always not liked about Code Pipeline, right? That attachment to a specific branch, and this is where Code Catalyst changes the way that AWS treats this, right? So really looking forward to see where this is going. But I would have one more follow-up on something that you mentioned earlier. You said, and that's maybe we can go to the deployment pipeline again, right? You mentioned
the actual deployment.
The actual deployment, because you said, well, this is pretty basic. In our projects, we do it differently. So what is missing here that you think that we as a best practice should be adding to our pipelines that we as builders build?
So the two obvious ones that I'd say up front is we're not running any linting and we're not running any unit tests. There are no unit tests in this particular project, which I would not allow in my position working. Like if some developer wrote something with no tests, I would be like, nope. But because I'm writing myself, I forgive myself. So,
I'm the same one.
yeah, definitely. So yeah, that was the obvious one. If I bring up this diagram actually from before, it'll show you one of the examples. So if I actually PR, just look at develop. Yeah, I've got PR. So in this case, for a pull request, the pipeline we're going to run. So obviously we do an NPM install and a build. We also run NPM Audit generally, because getting on top of NPM security issues seems to be something that's quite forgotten in a lot of places I've been, especially when I used to work at an enterprise company. You had to get authorization to download NPM packages from the security team. You weren't allowed to do it yourself. So the thought of doing that every time a particular little error comes up saying, oh, this has got some security flaw, it's very draining, but obviously it's so important. So I would suggest NPM Audit. And actually what we did in that case is if it came back with any issues, it would fail the pipeline. So you just couldn't go ahead. But if you need to override it for emergency fixes and so on, then that's one of the things that you might have to have a way to ignore it with a parameter or some way to get around it, because sometimes you've got that 2 a.m. fix that you need to get out and you can't go updating NPM packages and increasing risk. But then, at that point, you unit test. So this particular part will run on a pull request, and it's the same. This was in Azure DevOps in this section, but that was the same YAML files, the same config that runs on pull request, but also runs on the develop branch and tags and so on.
So what is part of NPM Audit in this case? Does it also include kind of security scanning or infrastructure as code scanning or something like that?
It's looking at your dependencies, your NPM dependencies. So we've not got on this particular thing. That's just running the built-in audit command, which it basically it looks for known vulnerabilities that have been reported in your packages. Obviously, I know there's tooling that people will put in to also look for security stuff, but this was just NPM dependencies. You've pulled in probably 10,000 of them, and you have no idea what's in them. So check.
Yep.
And then at that point, we'll create these branch named environments, like I've just demonstrated. But for this customer, they create a system, a CRM system, which needs to deploy, and they actually have multiple customers. So they might have 10 customers. So we actually have each customer has their own dev, staging, and production, but it's the same code base. So what we actually did is as soon as the build succeeded, we created for each customer A, B, and C in this case, it created the stacks in 3 separate accounts. And at that point, when they've been created, we would run the end-to-end test or integration test, or in this case, we use Cucumber to run tests hitting the API, which was kind of the ingress. So it's kind of an end-to-end, but it's more for integration testing in the cloud. And the results of that would get published, in this case, as your DevOps. So you've got the history of results and coverage and so on. And obviously, if it fails, so you need to have all your dev environments deployed to and all the tests passing before you can continue. And that was a conscious decision we made, that if you're making a change, that's probably for customer A. It's a feature that customer A wanted. That feature is going to get deployed to customer B and C as well. So you need the regression testing to pass. So it can be quite heavy, but that's one of the reasons we did the pattern I just showed you, is because it's not just one dev environment. It's potentially 10 dev environments.
Yep, makes sense.
And then at that point, really, if the pull request gets accepted and we go into develop in this case, which was the trunk for this particular business, it had the same build, the same deploy, but obviously at this point it's going into a develop or a main. So it's overwriting. And then if that whole section succeeds, we'd actually go off into UAT deployment. Now, UAT deployment is where it starts to get slightly different. Because what we actually do is we have a manual approval because we don't want to impact the customer because, again, in this specific scenario, they're not doing full continuous deployment. The customer needs to actually say whether we're allowed to do that deployment because they're doing their own testing and so on. So we'd actually run a CDK synth and then a diff against the environment immediately. And then if there's no diff, then it would just finish. So sometimes you make a change and that change is kind of behind a specific config. So CDK doesn't need to deploy something for customer B and C because it's a feature that's disabled for them. If it's a feature that is there, especially for multiple ones, it'd go into a manual approval, which in Azure DevOps would send an email to the specific people for them to go and press the button. And then if they do approve it, we do a CDK deploy from the synth. So we don't actually need to do an install and a build or anything. We're using the exact same. We know that diff is what's going to get deployed. And then, for production, it's basically the same sort of productive things. But in this case, it was a tag, like I showed before. So we do the build. And this is the bit where I always get a bit why I'd prefer not to use tagging. The ideal system to me would be to go straight from UAT deploy into the separate prod deploy.
That's something that I wanted to ask next. At the end, the idea and the concept of having immutable artifacts that are then promoted throughout different environments, it's something that I've heard before. You are not using that, right? Which is fine. What was the reason for not going into that direction?
It's been tricky to get it to work, if I'm being honest. It's just tricky to get it to work properly. So in this scenario, you've got a synth which you can deploy. So you'd ideally go, and if we're going to go straight down, then we would probably just take that synth and do a diff and then deploy to production, and that would work okay. Now in this client, they wanted the specific thing of using tagging, and so to get that to work, you have a tag, and now that tag is its own branch effectively. So you can't use the artifact because you don't actually know, because this could be like an emergency fix or something. So at that point, it follows the same process, the same CI process, but completely. The artifact being deployed is technically not the artifact that was manually tested on UAT.
On the other side, that approach makes it easier for you to roll with something back at the end, right? Because you can just move the tag or at the end trigger a deployment on a different tag again, and it's going to fix that stuff for you, right? So I'm also not really sure what the best approach here is, to be honest. Have you used CDK pipelines?
I tried it on my own project. I don't think it's open source, but I tried it.
The point I'm trying to make is that there is this neat feature of adding a wave deployments at the end, right? Where then the CDK pipeline, which essentially is a code pipeline at the end, will effectively handle that kind of synthesizing, storing the immutable artifact, and then promoting it up to higher environments, right? So that's one of the neat features that CDK Pipelines has. But as I said, right, it's depends on the project and how you want to drive things, right? So it makes total sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm coming from on-prem where we had VMs and dev boxes and Jenkins and these sort of systems, and then going into AWS where they have multiple AWS accounts that are completely segregated. It's quite interesting that you can't, the way the deployment is sort of separate from it's really interesting finding these different patterns. And this was something we built up over time, because we were originally wanting to deploy a change set from one account to another. So if you're doing pipelines, code pipeline, you've got, where do you have your code pipeline running for production? Do you have it in the production account, or do you have it in a CI account, or do you have it on the UAT account where you deploy across account and so on? There's a lot of options.
That's true. Wow. Great conversations, Martyn. We're reaching kind of the 45 minutes, so I would want to start wrapping up. So let's stop sharing your screen so we can maybe get you back on a bigger kind of place in the video. And before we end the session, what do you think that we can do from a community perspective, right? So you're now joining the community builders, which is a fantastic opportunity to help to drive the community. What do you think we need to do better from a CI/CD perspective and really focusing on CI/CD?
I think it's the realistic use cases is the thing that's missing, because we're all going to create these open source projects where we are the ones controlling it. So we make the decisions. We say, oh, this is the way it's going to deploy. We don't have a dev and a prod and a UAT. We don't have a manual approval. We don't have a compliance department. We don't have that manager who wants everything to be ticked by him. So there's all these things which are the realities of working in organizations, especially bigger organizations, or in our case, working with different clients who all have different needs. All of them things you could say are problems, and you could kind of take the premise of they're doing it wrong and we're doing it right, but actually that's not the real world. So I think real scenarios where you can say, if you have a compliance need, this is a kind of pattern. If the customer dictates that you can't do continuous deployment to production, yes, it's a great idea, but they don't want that. You can't convince them. You shouldn't just give up. We need to know what's the best way of doing that. And especially, I think, when it comes to serverless and the automation and the fact that the testing is a bit different to how a traditional app would work. So you need to make sure that you have kind of a different test pattern. I think it's just these kind of more realistic scenarios that we all probably see day to day, but we like to forget about when we get home, because it's a lot easier to just do the fun stuff, which is
so the cloud enables us to be quick in deploying stuff, but if we do personal projects, we then tend to forget the need of having some guardrails, at least, right, to ensure that what reproduces high quality code, right? Thank you so much for that input. I think this is really cool, and it will also help others to think about this a little bit in more details. So before we end, where can people find you online? What drives you? How can people connect to you if they have questions?
Well, I've got my Twitter, which you can get to. Connect on LinkedIn. Definitely, I'm trying to connect with as many builders as possible. The community builder program, obviously, as soon as I'm in the Slack, start messaging me, because I'd love to do collaborations. And one of the things that's really interesting with working with different people in a business is everyone's got different ideas, and then you go home and you sit on your own, and it's very easy to just go down a route. But as soon as you collaborate, it's really, really, can be really useful. Other than that, obviously, you can always check out my blog and things like that to find out where I'm trying to put my learnings out there, and hopefully there'll be more of that. Obviously, now that I'm in the builders, that should hopefully start.
Cool. And please make sure that you drop
a little bit from every few months to.
Sorry, my PC was sleeping again. Cool. Sounds awesome. Please make sure to send me those links so I can add them to the video when we upload it. With that, Martyn, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Looking forward to have more collaboration with you and with the rest of the folks that you've been working with, right? And thanks for taking the time to show your idea and also your vision of how we should do CI/CD and should talk about CI/CD going forward.
Thank you very much for doing this. Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching some more of this series because, yeah, I'd like to see how other people are doing this.
Yeah, have a great rest of your day and see you soon in Slack.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.